Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today, being here in the space, and to everyone that is online on our YouTube live stream. We're grateful for what is a very important and timely discussion on strategies for eviction resistance. My name is Tahiyya Islam. I'm on the education team here at the People's Forum. So we were already in the midst of planning this panel before the August 26th Supreme Court decision to block the Biden administration's extension of the eviction moratorium. We also know that every state has a different context here. And with no rent cancellations in sight and the consequences of contemporary capitalism and COVID-19, we all sense the horrible scale of the looming housing and eviction crisis. We're joined today by a very diverse group of organizers, scholars, and educators to provide insight and share experiences organizing around this issue. I'll do a very quick intro now. So we have Savina Martin, who's here on Zoom with us from the National Union of the Homeless and the Massachusetts Poor People Campaign. Glyn Robbins, right here on the left, has campaigned on housing for 30 years between the US and UK, and currently is based in the Bronx as a Fulbright scholar from CUNY. We have David Harvey, author and scholar and a distinguished professor of anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City of the University of New York. And Rebecca Gerard is the current legislative director of Citizen Action of New York, is part of Housing Justice and New York State's Poor People's Campaign. So for the formats of today's talk, we'll have everyone speak. The order of speaking will be David, then Savina, then Glyn, and then Rebecca. I'll also ask for you all to introduce yourselves more thoroughly. Then we'll have some comments and questions between speakers and then open it up into Q&A. And with that, I will pass it over. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. It's a really important discussion. And David, you are first.
This is okay. I haven't really been able to get out much because of the COVID, so I've not been around in the city too much, so I'm going to get some better feel as to what's going on the ground, and it's very good to be back in the People's Forum as well, so let's see that activism can still be somehow or other articulated on the ground. So, but a couple of things by way of introduction, and this may seem a very, very long way from everything that you're thinking about. But right now I'm a bit obsessed with trying to understand what's happening in China, which is of course a long way away. But it seems to me that the whole Chinese system and economy is being recalibrated and reset around a completely different set of priorities. During the pandemic, billionaires were erupting all over the place in China. Somebody calculated 1 every 36 hours. And the party clearly has had enough of that. They feel that the revolution which occurred with Deng Xiaoping, which marketized the economy, has played its role in generating tremendous productive capacity. And now they wanted to do something really radically different. And Xi, in one of his speeches, said that we have 3 mountains to climb. One is both production and access to adequate housing. The other was access and provision of educational opportunities. And then the third was healthcare. And for somehow or other, I generated a little fantasy in my mind, and I imagined a conversation occurring in 1979, after Margaret Thatcher had just been elected to be Prime Minister, and she's having a conversation with a man called Keith Joseph, who was in the Institute of Economic Affairs, which was the sort of right-wing think tank. And that Keith Joseph said to Margaret, he said, "Margaret, you've got 3 mountains to climb. You've got to privatize all education, all healthcare, and all housing." And that, in fact, has been the neoliberal politics, really, from the 1979, 1980 onwards. And it moves step by step, and it occurs differently in different places. Of course, in Britain, there was a lot of social housing. It was all privatized, or at least 90% of it was. But and in this country, of course, it was a different situation, and there's always been a kind of an attempt to recognise that public housing was rather inferior, even though it was very much in demand. So right now, what we're seeing is the takeover of housing, both rental and sort of residential, by big capital. And one of the groups that I'm really concerned with is Blackstone, who seems to have their finger in everything. I was talking to some people from Barcelona the other day, and their big problem? Blackstone. Blackstone is in China. It's just withdrawn because the Chinese are starting to jump on their property development companies. One of the biggest ones may be forced into bankruptcy. And Glyn and I were talking a little earlier. I think we're both convinced that the next crisis, which is likely to come in capitalism, is going to be around housing provision, and it's going to be housing provision from the capitalist standpoint as well as housing provision from the user standpoint. So here we have this situation where this is the background, if you like, to this whole kind of problem of the inability to pay either mortgages or rents, and then if you can't pay the rents, there's a problem of how do the small landlords survive. Those sorts of issues are sitting on the table right now. And part of the problem, and this is the problem, of course, that Donald Trump created, he created so many problems that you don't know which one to concentrate on. If you're housing in the morning, then it's healthcare in the afternoon, and then it's electoral access in the evenings. And it's difficult to see exactly how to concentrate. But a lot of that, I think, in the end is going to be determined by social action. And it is, in this case, the question is, how much social action can be generated around the evictions. And I think that here, I was always puzzled somewhat by the fact that during the crisis of 2007, 2008, when, I don't know, something like 7 or 8 million households lost their housing, that there was not more public protest. There was some, and there was, knew some people involved, but it wasn't massive, it wasn't widespread. And one of the reasons I was told was that some of the people who had paid their mortgages resented some of the speculative activity of those who didn't. And so there was a kind of blaming the victim strategy on the part of the media, and that stuck to some degree. But this is a rather different situation. It seems to me it's fairly obvious that most of the people who couldn't pay not because they were profligate and not because they did stupid things, but because they were caught in the pandemic. And that therefore is the social responsibility to recognize that there is a certain right to housing, and that right to housing is such that something has to be done to try to protect people's, and here this is going to have to be done in Congress, but it's going to have to be done against the background of considerable public protest. And as I understand it, there is a building movement of some kind, and that is the sort of thing that I very much look forward to listening to. But I think that when we're at this question of the evictions, it has to be against the background of a far more radical reform of housing provision and housing access, and that this has to be thoroughgoing and complete, and that therefore the eviction movement should be embedded, if you like, in this broader movement. And I think now is a time to go for it, because when you look at what I would call this sort of a lot of this insane urbanization which we see around us in New York. I mean, go up here and look at Hudson Yards. It's one of the most stupid, wasteful pieces of investment you can imagine, and you see it all over the city. It's not as if they can't build things, they're building the wrong kinds of things in the wrong places for the wrong people in the wrong way, and that therefore there is a moment where we need to really transform the whole process of housing production, housing utilization, and really try to take some lessons from what might be happening in China, as China starts to say, well, we're going to make very real this possibility of socialism for 2049 or whatever it is. And one of the planks of that socialism is we're going to have to climb those three mountains. And I think we have to climb those three mountains too. But particularly on the housing one, this is a very important moment in the struggle for adequate housing for the mass of the population. So thank you. Glyn.
We have Savina next.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David.
Savina, 1 second. We're going to pull you up to the screen here in person.
Wonderful.
All right, Savina, you're good to go. We're going, just give us a heads up when you want us to change slide here in person, all right?
Sure.
Okay.
I'm just going to give a little bit of history. Again, my name is Savina Martin, and I serve in the National Union of the Homeless, and I'm also a tri-chair on the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign. I believe I'm going to wear primarily tonight the hat of the National Union of the Homeless. So over 30 years ago, I joined the National Union of the Homeless. The history there and the struggle and context for civil rights helped to shape and prepare me to enter into the fight to unite the bottom and poverty with and alongside some of the most talented, skilled, savvy, and courageous and righteously angered organizers in the mid-1980s. It was in the union where I would meet, train, and travel with a core group of leaders who, like myself, emerged during a period of increasing poverty and inequality, whereby homelessness was crowning, more visible on the outskirts of communities and downtown in many urban centers throughout the US. Over time, we built multiracial locals to demand our right to live in decent and affordable rent-adequate housing, demanding that the crisis of homelessness is a direct violation of our human rights. We demanded fairness and dignity throughout the shelter industrial complex. Knowing then, as we are clear today, that no one was coming to save us. The rich would get richer while the poor got poorer. Therefore, we realized we must practically unite from the very bottom to teach, think, fight, and lead as a united force of the poor class of workers, waged and unwaged. We organized massive resistance, protest, arrest, and takeovers against a state apparatus that demonized and tried to divide us. Nevertheless, we organized across those lines of division. The union then, and you can change the slide, was formed in over 25 cities across the US, and at our height, we had back then 75,000 members and hundreds of thousands poor and dispossessed individuals and families, supporters and clergy in support of our militant efforts to take action together. We also held founding conventions in places like the historic Riverside Church, where we fed over 1,000 people during our New York State Convention in the late 1987, somewhere around there, 88 perhaps. Same efforts took place in cities like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where the union operated out of a church basement, the first homeless shelter in the US run by and for the poor. We formed in Philadelphia, Delaware Valley, Boston, Minneapolis, New Orleans, Sacramento, California, Chicago, Gary, Illinois, New Mexico, and Detroit, Wayne County, where we teamed up with the National Welfare Rights Union and the Hunger Coalition to host our Up and Out of Poverty 1989 Poverty Summit. There we began strategizing for our massive simultaneous housing takeovers. The winter offensives, we called them, launched during the Christmas season, which is commercialized, and we resisted that, entitled and named it No Room at the Inn, right? Jesus was a homeless revolutionary. We used the Johnny Tillman model of organizing the poor, the homeless, our unwaged workers, our mothers and their children, and skilled laborers. We all came together. We were at the forefront of our fight for our class of poor. We stayed on the ground in the trenches and in homeless encampments, directly in that school of struggle where the fight, the teaching, and training was being waged. We used slogans like, "You only get what you organize to take," or, and you can change the slide, "We may be homeless, but not helpless." And together we would take the necessary action, together. Homelessness had entered public discourse as large numbers of children and families without shelter disrupted Skid Row assumptions, you see. At that time, and according to some reports or some credible reports, it estimated in the mid-1990s suggested that at least 700,000 persons were literally homeless on any given night, of which at that time, 425,000 had no available emergency shelter. And only 46% of persons were single men during that time, as they say, many of whom held jobs as temporary day laborers, and veterans like myself who had experienced homelessness and the complexities of navigating through a system which regard the poor as human industrial waste. We had nothing to lose but our chains and would soon launch a massive wave of simultaneous housing takeovers. The housing takeovers were filmed and documented by Peter Kanoy and Pam Yates of Skylight Pictures, who captured the secret planning, tactics, and strategy meetings and direct action to tear off the boards of vacant and abandoned housing in over 17 cities. About 9 or so cities were filmed during that time. Newspapers, articles, and you can change the slide, and periodicals can be searched in library databases today. In June of 2019, now, the National Union of the Homeless reestablished itself at a Poor People's Campaign convening, where today several original members of the National Union of the Homeless are part of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. I also serve as statewide tri-chair, as I mentioned earlier, with the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign. A few of our original members today, we gathered in DC at one of our congresses in 2019 and made a collective decision to re-establish the union due to the influx of inquiries we were receiving across the US of these deteriorating conditions and criminalization of the poor, the opioid crisis, healthcare crisis, death and burial of our poor, and the spontaneous upcropping of unions happening throughout the US. All of these interlocking injustices are affecting us now, and we were in a pandemic before the pandemic. Today, we can hardly keep up with the capacity due to the crisis of housing, COVID-19, evictions, and threats of evictions across the US. And as I sum up, our union structure today is made up of 17-member executive board, 3 councils, a veterans council, clergy and legal, organizing teams, and a marine water division, and about 4 regional coordinators and a communications division. We have 2 senior advisors, an organizing leader, a national secretary who fills the shoes of our late Juan Casanova, one of our fallen comrades. And early this year, we lost Patrick Braswell, a leader of our New York Union of the Homeless. Currently, and today, right now, we're having an executive board meeting where we are preparing for a second National Officers Training School, where leaders gather locally, especially in California, one of our largest contingents. They just returned from a statewide freedom ride, exploring, gathering, and comparing information, visiting tent cities and farming unions in various cities and coastal towns throughout California. So the large urban cities mobilization has shifted in comparison to the 1980s, and where our focus now is in rural, forgotten poor white counties. These are the counties that are contacting us because they want to set up a union. For example, in Massachusetts, our concentration has been in the most poor white rural counties. And also, these members are also part of the Poor People's Campaign, whereby we are still, and let me say, we're in the very embryonic stages of mobilization. Today, we are fused with a broad network of leaders nationwide where we are not isolated. We work closely with the National Welfare Rights Union, supporting their efforts in fight around water, food, and the welfare of ourselves as it relates to the declaration is to take action together. Can you hear me?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Savina. With that, we're going to pass it over to our next speaker.
I didn't know if you could hear me. I kind of ended abruptly, but.
That's okay. We hear you, Savina. Thank you so much. Awesome. We're going to pass it over to our next speaker, Glyn Robbins. We ask that you introduce yourself again and take us away.
Okay. Yeah, by way of introduction, in addition to what's already been said, I currently am spending time with a local campaign organisation in the Bronx called CASA, Community Action for Safe Apartments, a brilliant, vibrant organisation. I know one of many here in the city, and we'll come on to why that's important. I've also had a long association with the National Alliance of HUD Tenants, which was based in Boston, but which is national. And I think importantly, and again I'll try and come back to this, is trying its best to campaign and organise with both private sector tenants and public housing tenants, which I think is a critical point. And then just finally, before I came here, for the previous 10 years, my job had been looking after a council estate or a public housing estate, as you would know them, which is where I first met David. And I was saying to Sally, I'm from East London, and incidentally, so were Samuel Gompers and former Mayor A. Beam from a previous period of crisis in the city. So apologies for both of them. But in a way, what I'm doing is a return visit for one made by the writer Jack London to East London in 1903. And he wrote in The People of the Abyss, "The workhouses have no space left in which to pack the starving crowds, craving every day and night for food and shelter. The charitable institutions have exhausted their supplies of food. The Salvation Army is besieged by hosts of the unemployed and hungry, for whom neither shelter nor the means of sustenance can be provided." So that was 118 years ago. Not much has changed. But quoting Jack London, whose writing I love incidentally, but who was an appalling racist, it's worth saying at the outset that all of what we discuss in this context is related to institutional racism. Racism is woven into the fabric of housing policy, not just here, but everywhere. And with that in mind, turning to the situation we face today, I mean, I'm hesitant to use the metaphor in a way, but it is just another form of global pandemic, isn't it? And actually one which is just as ruinous in some ways of people's lives. And I've got family up in northern Canada, and they've been writing to me, telling me about how difficult it is to get a home up there. I mean, there's, I don't know if you've ever been up there, but you know, there's plenty of space. It's not about the availability of land. But again, the institutional investors have got their fingers in those pies as well, including places where First Nation Americans are trying to live. And a few weeks ago, I was on a family reunion back in Ireland, and Ireland again is kind of bracing itself for a repetition actually of the crisis that it had not that long ago around housing. and all of the newspapers are full of the issue. And I picked up the Sunday Independent, this is from 3 weeks ago, and the headline, 500 million euros for developers to coax them back to building. And I think this really illustrates one of the key obstacles that we face when we're talking about strategies for eviction resistance, because whatever else we say, whatever else we may or may not agree on, we have to be absolutely clear that it is the market, the capitalist property market, that has got us into this mess, and it is not going to get us out of it. No matter how many more subsidies they get, this is not going to work, and we know that. So I want to say a bit about what I've seen since I've been here, and make a few comparisons with back home, and maybe some suggestions for where we go from here. But first, to congratulate the tenant and housing movement of New York. I've been lucky enough to be here for 3 months now, and as David said, there has been a real upswell of protest. I think there were 5 separate, well, I went on 4, and I think I missed one while I was in Ireland, 5 separate street protests in New York City during the month of August. And I must say, when I first got here, and that was in late June, I think there was a sense of an understandable fatigue, you know, that maybe the movement didn't have the energy to go another round. And that turned significantly in August, and of course culminated last week in the extension of the eviction ban into next year. And I just think we have to celebrate that. I know the Housing Justice for All campaign were celebrating it literally last night, and I was there with them. But of course, most importantly, that keeps people in their homes. And that's what matters most in one sense. But also, I think we need to recognise that as a direct challenge to one of the base tenets of capitalism, i.e. that the rights of landlords always trump the rights of tenants, even during a deadly pandemic. And actually, New York State will, come January, have been not eviction-free, but a fair degree of protection from eviction for tenants for 23 months. It's a magnificent achievement, not one that I'm aware of being repeated elsewhere, certainly not at home. So in thinking about next steps, I want to just take a couple of steps back, not to lapse into historical nostalgia, but again, you don't need me to tell you that the working class of New York have campaigned for and won some fantastic victories around housing for 100 years or more. And I think when I go home and tell people that in this city that in a way epitomizes the capitalist city, the capitalist metropolis, something like 25% of homes are actually outside of the market. So again, you know this, but 1 million or so stabilised rent apartments, 170,000 and odd public housing homes, plus the co-ops, which I hope some of you will be able to join a celebration of the workers' co-ops. There's a flyer on your seats, which I'm having or helping to organise up at the Amalgamated, the oldest workers' housing co-op in New York. And that was created by workers and trade unionists. And the reason I mention it is because we need to be thinking about solutions right now. And we don't need to be reinventing the wheel. The Amalgamated is still there, 700 plus homes that are genuinely affordable for working class New Yorkers. And there are many other examples in this city. But above all, I am an advocate for public housing, council housing as we call it. It's been my job as partly the reason, but it's not the only reason. I've lived in council housing. My daughter is still a council tenant. My family were council tenants, and it was, in a way, life-changing for all of us in different respects. And here is the bedrock of New York. If you took NYCHA away from New York, in some respects, the city would crumble. It's absolutely fundamental to the identity of the city, I would say, as it is in other cities. And so now, of all times, is not the time to be privatising it. It's the time to be investing in public housing. And when I think about the Orwellianly named rental assistance demonstration, which if people don't know about, you need to find out about RAD. Certainly NYCHA tenants are finding out about it at the moment, and council tenants in Britain fought against something very similar, actually getting on for 20 years ago. It's partly how I got involved in housing campaigning through an organisation called Defend Council Housing. And RAD is very similar to the kind of privatisation which David's alluded to, which council housing has faced for many, many years. And as David said, the watershed moment in a way was 79 with the election of Thatcher, at which point, and again, this might be a statistics that you're not so familiar with, in 1979-80, about a third of British households were council tenants. So it was mainstream. It was respectable, whatever that might mean. It was even aspirational. And actually, I think if we invested in council housing again, it could be all of those things once more, as I'm sure public housing here could be. That 30% is now somewhere around 6%. So although we've fought and won some battles, we've lost a lot more. But it isn't all gone yet, and there's still stuff to fight for. But if we want to stop the kind of continuous fighting against eviction, we have to campaign, among other things, for restoring publicly owned housing everywhere. The other day I went up to the Harlem River houses, which again, if people haven't been, it's well worth going. It's one of the first public housing developments in this city. And looking at it from a sort of worker's eye, I can see that it wouldn't take much actually to make that place look better than it is. Now obviously there is a huge backlog of investment that's needed to catch up repairs and so on. But partly what's missing is a lack of care. That's what's not there, is the idea that you need to look after these places. And that's something that I think we need to incorporate in the campaign moving on from today. And it's easier said than done. But as David said again, I think if not now, then when? This is a moment of opportunity in some respects, albeit a tragic one. And as my friend and yours maybe, Dave Madden, who's at the LSE, as I am sometimes, has written, from housing and healthcare to social infrastructure and basic working conditions, the political economic status quo has been revealed as incapable of meeting the needs of everyday life. And we knew that really before March 2020. But I think our task is to persuade people that something can be done about it. And that's difficult, but maybe that doesn't begin with a call for 10 million more units of public housing, although actually in Britain we did manage to promote the idea of 100,000 new council homes under the auspices of the sadly demised now Corbyn project. So it's not impossible to connect the idea of the housing crisis with the idea of an expansion of public housing rather than a privatisation of it. And there is an eternal truth, and I'm getting towards the end. But back again to the first houses, literally the public housing in this city that was amongst the first in the country, 1935 down on East 3rd Street. Harry Hopkins, who was FDR's New Deal advisor, when he was opening the place, said something I just think rings down the years, and in a way we should always intone at every meeting like this. Private capital never spent a dime to build a house for a poor person. And that was true in 1935, and it's true now. So, I've got 4 suggestions to make in terms of where I think we should go. First of all, I think the eviction fight has to continue. We need to move it beyond the 15th of January, which will come around very soon. For the reasons I've said, it's important, and I've got every confidence that that will happen here, and I hope it will happen elsewhere. I would also suggest, and this might be a bit controversial, that we need to we definitely need to broaden out the housing campaign. And maybe one way to do that is for our movement to rally behind the 3.4 trillion or whatever it is reconciliation budget that the Biden administration is currently introducing. Now, I know that is, as I said, fraught with difficulty in some respects, but actually does include some serious money for housing, including $80 billion for public housing. I think our movement needs to hold our noses to some extent and try and make sure that that bill becomes law and that spending is allocated, because that could be a way of broadening out the campaign, and as I say, including public housing tenants as well in that effort. And also, third on my list of 4, we have to find a way of involving our trade unions more in the housing struggle. I know that's difficult here. We haven't done a lot better at home, I would say, but again, of course, trade unions are critical, as we can see from the amalgamated in the past. And of course, you know, a lot of workers and trade union members are also people who are suffering because of the housing crisis. But then my final point, and I'm nervous about making it because I'm in danger of tiptoeing into to Marxist theory with David sitting next to me. But, you know, I think we need to fully understand the power of the housing and tenant movement. And I think in a way we underestimate it. Because what happened before the eviction ban last Wednesday, a demonstration here, which I was on, had about 300 people on it. It was fantastic. How many tenants are there in New York? Millions. And that applies in many, many countries around the world who are suffering in a similar way to the people here. And so I'm going to suggest that we need to start rethinking how we contextualise and conceptualise the housing and tenant movement and begin to see it as the 21st century equivalent of the 19th century industrial proletariat with the power and capacity and potential to change the world. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Glyn. We're passing it to Rebecca.
Can you hear me? Yes? Great. So I am Rebecca Gerard. As was stated, I am the Legislative Director for Citizen Action. Prior to that, I was the Campaigns Manager for Housing Justice with Citizen Action, so organized around tenant rights and the rights for those who are unhoused across the state. Serve on the Coordinating Committee of Housing Justice for All, and also am on the steering committee of the New York State Poor People's Campaign. So I've had the honor of working with Savina Patrick, who she mentioned was a dear friend of mine. You know, Glyn and I spoke before this started, and we talked about the risk of going last and there being nothing left to say. Thankfully, I still think I have something to contribute. Hopefully you agree. I think I want to start with the organizing and end with the solutions. You know, really want to affirm what has been stated, that everything that has been won in terms of housing rights has been due to the power of organizing, whether it's 2019, right, when we brought 2,000 people to Albany and took a rest outside of the Senate and the Assembly, and won the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, to what has taken place over the last few months with numerous, right, instances of civil disobedience. Everything we've won has been a true power to the people. I really also feel like I need to give a huge shout out to Congressmember Cori Bush too, because I will say there was so much little political appetite in this state to revisit the idea of another moratorium, and what she did at the Capitol, and obviously then joined by other Congress people, but what she started with sleeping on the steps of the Capitol when the federal CDC moratorium had expired, and there was no will at the national level to do anything, and she was like, nope, not going home till something is done about this, really shifted the momentum in a way that impacted us here in New York and gave us something to build on at the state level tenant movement, right? So I feel like I would be remiss if I did not tip my hat to her. And it's rare to have politicians who you feel like you want to do that with, so don't want to miss that moment. I couldn't agree more with what Glyn was just saying, in that we needed to fight for these moratoriums. It's necessary, probably will still be necessary. But I think what has frustrated me the most over the last 18 months is that the tenant movement has been forced into a position of everything we've been fighting for is reactive, is a Band-Aid to what is a systemic problem. And as we've been in a position where we haven't been able to fight for systemic solutions to what we know is a housing system that's based in racial capitalism that is always going to find us in these moments of crisis. And if we can't get back to organizing around upending those systems, we are always going to have these moments of crisis where we have to turn people out and we're just kicking the can down the road. And so I'm really centered in shifting right now to no, right? Like now we need to get back to fighting for things that change this. And David said this, right? This country is so steeped in property rights that's based in racism, and how that irony is lost on some people when this country was colonized. I mean, so if we really cared about property rights, the native people would be, you know, our indigenous neighbors would own all the land, but clearly it's a convenient racial narrative, right, that is fed to us. and we would have reparations, but that's not a thing either, right? So it's a very convenient narrative, and I do think we've changed hearts and minds, and yet also, if you listen to some of the comments when they voted on the moratorium, still some of our Democratic electeds participate in very blatant tenant shaming, right? And poverty shaming. So we aren't even close to where we need to be. So what do I think solutions look like? I have like short and immediate, to me, things that need to happen to get us to a place where we start to have a society that recognizes housing as a right, not a commodity, which is where I think we all agree we need to be. We absolutely cannot spend another dollar towards development. Both of these very wise gentlemen pointed that out. Development will happen, sadly, whether we do that or not, right? And that fuels the housing crisis. As was stated, if that was a solution, we wouldn't be in a crisis. Every policy that's existed has thrown money at it, and yet we see that the crisis has only exploded in the last few decades, right? Every policy has centered in more development will solve it, and yet the opposite trajectory has occurred. It has just ballooned. So if we took every dollar in subsidies and incentives and tax breaks that we gave developers and invested it in public housing and money that would fund tenant opportunity to purchase, right? Residential cooperatives, community land banks and land trusts, right? Ownership in the form of social housing, we would at least start to be able to compete with these corporate, private equity entities who are literally becoming owners of our entire country. And Blackstone, as was mentioned, is the most terrifying example. On our road to doing that, to me, and this is the immediate for next year, there are some things that have to happen. And the first step of that is good cause eviction that we've been fighting for since 2019. And I really want to explain why, right? The first reason is the organizing that Glyn talked about. If we are really going to build a mass movement where we can get more people participating in organizing, that is very hard to do if a tenant can be evicted for no reason at all. And that is true for 4 to 5 million tenants in this state. They can be fulfilling every obligation of their tenancy, and yet it's perfectly legal to say, you're evicted. We have holdover evictions that are legal, and so tenant organizing becomes extremely difficult in unregulated tenant situations. And so if we could just take off the table a situation where that is a thing, it would make tenant organizing and building tenant power immensely more easy to accomplish, right? The other thing is, 2 other things, right? Just in the very short term, we have tenants who live in really horrendous conditions, no ability to complain because of the same fear, right? They would have that ability to say, hey, I actually deserve hot water. I deserve to not have sewage coming out of my faucet, you know? I deserve to not have my child be lead poisoned. All of those things would then be a possibility for the 4 to 5 million tenants who don't have it now. And lastly, it prohibits unreasonable rent increases that aren't attached to investment. And when I think of the scourge of gentrification, right, this is the most immediate mechanism that could begin to slow that. Because what do we know? When development comes in, and again, long-term we need to stop that, but that's gonna take a while. I wish I had something I could say that would stop that tomorrow, but I don't. When development comes in, what do we know? It is never for the benefit of the community members that have lived generationally in an area. It displaces them, right? It brings in wealthier, whiter tenants, and that proximity to resources, that proximity to whiteness, means that the black and brown communities who have lived there are displaced. They can't afford the rents. Residences that are just haven't had anything change in their conditions, have rents go up, and all of a sudden neighborhoods are completely erased, and the fabric of the whole community is gone. And so if we said you're not allowed to raise the rent or evict someone to import somebody wealthier and whiter, we could start to stabilize communities in a way that's never ever been possible, right? So there are long-term goals, and there are some really short-term actionable things that we can do that would prevent these evictions that are so destabilizing to our communities, right? And start to really focus on building structures that would provide stability globally. I'll stop there.
Amazing. Thank you so much to Savina, to Glyn, David, and Rebecca for sharing. We're now going to open it up to conversation between all of you. We're going to pull up Savina up here again, and I'll give it off to y'all to ask each other some questions and be in conversation, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Well, yeah, I would be interested to know what other people think about the Biden plan, for the want of a better term. As I said, I can see that there are problems and the limitations of bourgeois democracy, or whatever we want to call it. But at the same time, you know, I was looking at the announcement yesterday about what some of that spending would be in terms of housing, and it feels to me like something that we should be getting behind. But maybe that's a bit presumptuous. What do you two think? And Anita back there.
I have thoughts, but I'm happy to go last because I just talked a lot, so I let my, or I'll lead off. And I think we desperately need the investment in public housing, so I think it's crucial. And HJ4A has been supportive, Housing Justice for All has been supportive of trying to ensure that that public housing investment stays in the reconciliation package. There's also the included, right, a huge influx of money for an expansion of vouchers. And I think that's probably much more controversial, to be honest with you, than the public housing piece. I will dip a toe and say, you know, vouchers are controversial because they feed the free market, which is bad. Having said that, I still think because of where we are in our housing structures, at this point, vouchers are necessary, especially when I think of our unhoused populations, right? Most of the vouchers that are available to the 100,000 people we have on any given day, which is a low estimate in this state, don't translate into housing, right? So I see at this point, right, vouchers really serving a niche to get people who are unhoused to be housed as we build out a system that slowly moves us from a free market to a decommodified system. And in terms of public housing, I would also add that I think we desperately need, right, to repeal the Faircloth Amendment, which prohibits the construction of more public housing, because we need much more of it, right? And that is another thing we could be working towards.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Rebecca. It was really good hearing you. I'm still moved. I had to log off and log back on because my speaker and internet was unstable. But, you know, I'm still stuck on and righteously angry, seeing over the course of my life, as you were pointing to gentrification, Rebecca, generations of families being displaced by, you know, spatial deconcentration, right? Being attacked by the state apparatus around, you know, the war on the poor, and I mean, and on and on and on, mass incarceration. I mean, I could just go on and on over the course of these years and decades of seeing entire communities being lost. And as I said earlier, we were always in a pandemic before the pandemic, and everything is racialized, right? This system of white supremacy is set up for us to be divided, right? Our forgotten rural communities are filled with poor white families that are suffering just as bad as our urban communities, right? And as Dr. King had mentioned, we need to organize across lines of division. Now, this system did not want that to happen. They don't want us to unite, right? Because we already know, and I'm preaching to the choir here, that we're a force to be reckoned with. But in the meantime, while we are waiting for vouchers, we have nothing to lose but our chains, and we must organize. So what's going to happen on the bottom? We know we've got to move the bottom in this economic crisis, this death-dealing society. And that, as a Poor People's Campaign clearly understands that and is pushing, through and working with and listening to and challenging this system of lawmakers, we still, the homeless, the poor, the disenfranchised, the poor and dispossessed, the most organized section of the working class, must still be able to survive on the bottom. I mean, I'm looking at the pandemic and saying, well, what can we do? There are some questions here. So how do we dig ourselves up and out of this? How do we dig ourselves up and out of this one? Where are the openings right now where we could, think tank our way into real solutions? Abolishing the housing authorities. Then the wait list there are sometimes 20 years long, right? The attacks on our families, in terms of when they're homeless, they don't have driver's license, they don't have a state license, they can't even afford to buy it most of the time, right? They're living in deplorable conditions within the shelter industrial complex. There aren't even shelter beds. We're not even prepared to catch and widen the net of these millions of homeless, of renters that are on the verge of being evicted. And this is real thinking, right? While our scholars and activists and researchers are continuing to write their dissertations and thesis and research, we still have to research ways to survive on the ground. So there's much to be done. I'm glad we're having this conversation. We need to challenge ourselves even deeper in these uncertain times that we're living in and come up with some real solutions. But in the meantime, we are organizing tactically some, around mass mobilization. Anyway, I'll just leave that there.
Maybe I could chime in here, but for somebody who spent most of his life wanting to be a revolutionary and ending up supporting weak-kneed reforms, I've given up in a sense. And you're right, we've got to push that stuff through. But it seems to me maybe we should be thinking of maybe 3 levels. One level is all the time the presumption is there that the only solution which is acceptable is a market-based solution. That has to be attacked again and again and again. And that's people like me come in as writers and so on, try and do work on that. There's another level which seems to me to be somewhere in between. And you mentioned something about, if renters had more protections, the organization would be easier. That in a sense, having that protection is a necessary condition for organizing. Now, it seems to me that this is something to be campaigned about, that if there could be a general campaign which is protecting tenants more and more in some ways, then the organization becomes easier. So there's a sort of a pathway, step by step through that. So this seems to me to be a sort of very interesting proposal that might be followed up on, and it involves, getting Albany involved and doing all that stuff again. And then there's another kind of level which is much more in the street, and plainly mass protests, I think at some point or other are going to have to occur. How they're going to occur, I really don't know. There are organizations around. You talk of the union movement, the Poor People's Campaign, and so on. And I think you're right that we cannot sit there and say, oh, there's a struggle over here, and that's separate from the struggle over there. Which leads me to one other question I have, which is what is the relationship between what's happening to renters and what's happening to those who are behind on their mortgage and likely get evicted because of their mortgage? Because I know damn well that Blackstone is waiting to jump on every one of those who's evicted. Ended up, it'll go into the bank, and Blackstone will do what it did in 2007, 2008. It tripled its holding, it increased its holdings by about tenfold during that period. So I think that the whole kind of question of protection of those people who are behind on their mortgages is also part and parcel of the story. So I'm not quite sure how we would approach that.
I'll speak to both and then I'll pass it. Very pleased to tell you that we have a very active campaign going for those protections. So if any of you have not heard about it, please see me after this. My goal is that we will pass that next year. And we have a campaign that we're launching in New York City around it. And we have about 13 campaigns across upstate right now, which we are going to ride that momentum into legislative session 2022. And I'm bound to determine that this is the year we're going to win it. And then in terms of the small landlords that you speak of, this curse Rebney and private equity, this is something they do very, very well, right? If true mom and pop landlords really thought in a policy perspective, they would be organizing with us, because the real estate industry, everything they fight for puts them at the back of the line. And we know this, right? But somehow they've done this really effective job of it's really Trumpian in my mind, right? Like, your proximity to us as this wealthy entity will somehow make you wealthy through osmosis. You don't want to be with the people who are poor, because somehow their poorness will leak onto you. And if you stand with us, this wealthy, somehow it will just leak onto you. And it's wildly effective and yet so illogical, right? Because every policy the real estate industry fights for puts those small landlords at the very, very, very back of the line. And so one of the things we have to do better in our movement, and Savina can speak to this, right? It's this core of the Poor People's Campaign, right? Is this cross, it's just what she said, right? They don't want us to organize together because that's a power they don't have. It's a very deliberate attempt to divide us. It's their worst nightmare to think of us organized together. That is their worst nightmare. But it's something we have to do a better job of accomplishing, because their ability to divide us, right, really does weaken us. It really does. And it's a constant challenge that I don't have an answer for. I wish I did.
I see you looking. Look, again, did you want to say something?
Yeah, but I don't mind waiting.
Look.
Well, okay. I just want to be clear. I'm not here as a secret admirer of Biden. The reason I raise it is because this is happening now, and there is a bit of a sense of, well, what do we do? Certainly in New York, what do we do after last Wednesday? And this is by no means a done deal, as I understand the politics here. This could not happen. And so I feel that he may not want the movement behind him, but he may need the movement behind him. And so with all the qualifications that people have talked about, and certainly including vouchers and the likelihood actually that a lot of this money would indeed end up in the pockets of developers come the day and be wasted and squandered. Nonetheless, I would argue still that it is potentially a unifying campaign. And I suppose, unless I misunderstood, I think David was referring not so much to the mythologized mum and pop landlords as working class people who are struggling with their mortgage. Not as landlords, but as maybe people in this room, and perhaps less likely in New York, but certainly in other parts of the country, people who have bought a home right at the edge of what they can afford and are soon not going to be able to afford it. And we saw the consequences of that dynamic back in 2007-8. And so again, and this is horribly cheeky of me in a way, but you know, I do have this kind of fantasized idea. I'm only here till Christmas, so I'm probably not going to be able to do anything about it. But you know, a national march for homes, Washington, DC, pick a date in 2022. It's difficult organising at the moment. But I just, you know, I think we need to sort of break out of some of the mental barriers we have around housing in all sorts of ways. And I've said about private tenants, public housing tenants, working class homeowners, the homeless, absolutely. But also think about the people who, I was out with do a bit of teaching at the LSE, and I was out with one of my former students earlier this week having a beer. And he's doing all right. He'd be the first to admit, you know, he's by no means at the bottom of the pile. But actually, and of course young people are particularly suffering because of all this in terms of their lives. You know, he's doing okay, he's got a reasonable job, time's on his side, etc., etc. But actually, his life is being, to a large extent, dictated by housing. And I think you can multiply from his example into the millions. So although a 1 million person march might be ambitious, particularly at the moment, I do think, again, that we underestimate the political potency of housing as an issue and as a way of unifying working class people, both here and everywhere.
So, you know, the Poor People's Campaign just completed, you know, part of a launch that we had. And I mean, we're still not done yet. It's called, we started at the top of the year, called the 500 Days of Fighting Forward Together. I'm pretty sure you've heard of it. In the third reconstruction, heading into June of 2022 with the massive march on Washington. I just thought I'd flag that.
One of the tactics I'm in favor of is shaming the opposition. And I mentioned Blackstone. The head of Blackstone is Stephen Schwarzman. He's one of the wealthiest billionaires ever. And he's just given something like $150 million to MIT and another $150 million to Oxford University in support of the humanities. Now, Blackstone has taken over housing worldwide at an astonishing rate. And it claims, and there's a case in Bushwick, which was described in the Financial Times right now, where this peculiar thing of getting the money to rehabilitate housing, you can get it by a big firm coming in and claiming a tax deduction of, so you invest $2 million and you get $3 million in tax deductions. So something gets set up that way, and the organization that's running this affordable housing complex in Bushwick, after this has gone on for 15 years, they had to set up a dummy corporation to manage it all. And now the organization expected to get the stuff back, and they can't get it back because AIG, which was the one who was doing the investing, said, no, you can't have it back. We want it. It's too valuable right now to give it back to you. So that is likely to be lost right now. And AIG has actually sold the investment on to Blackstone. So Blackstone is taking it over, saying, we are the ones who are going to solve the affordable housing problem. Well, their record is terrible. The UN report against them last year which actually talked about some of their tactics. And just to give you an example of their tactics, they took over a big affordable housing complex in Oakland, I think it was. They use it, they leverage, they borrow money to do it. So they borrowed money from the California pension fund that needed a rate of return, said to the California pension fund, you lend us the money and we'll give you an 8% rate of return or something like that, and we'll then use the money to purchase this whole complex. They were supposed to leave it as affordable housing, but they then somehow or other managed to say, well, about a tenth of it has to be shaved off to be turned into market housing because that's the only way we can finance the whole kind of thing. So they had to evict people. Now, the interesting thing was that some of the people who got evicted were pensioners with the California state pension system. So here's this ridiculous situation. Here are these people evicted to protect their pensions. And this is the kind of ridiculous kind of system which people like Blackstone sets up. So Blackstone's headquarters is in New York. Maybe a little picketing of Blackstone would be a good idea. And the other thing is that Blackstone is incredibly important. When I mentioned Barcelona, when the Deputy Prime Minister of Spain came to the United States, who was the first person he went to see? Schwartzman. They're in. And you mentioned the kind of the power of the developers. And we really have to highlight the power and the power of the investment and the power of the private equity systems that are being set up. So there is a capacity here, it seems to me, to draw attention to the fact that a lot of this ridiculous, insane, wasteful urbanization we see around here is good for capital. And interestingly, it's good for capital even if it goes bankrupt. They don't actually care whether it works or not. It's just simply, the construction and all of the things of the architects and everybody gets paid, and then the thing goes bankrupt and they don't care. They go on to the next one. So we're getting this insane form of urbanization going on, and it's powered by these organizations. And there's Stephen Schwartzman, wealthiest person in the world, a great supporter of Donald Trump. He got into Trump's administration. Now, let's go after some of these people. Let's make it embarrassing for them that in fact they are part of the serious problems of the denial of housing to the mass of the population, and that needs it, and that has absolutely nothing to do with decent affordable housing, even though the claim they make on their website is that they are the ones who are giving the private market solution to the affordable housing problem. That's what they're saying. That has to be contested, and they have to be contested in terms of their enormous economic and political power.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss immediately before we open it up to questions? I think we're ready for questions. If anyone would like to ask one, I will hand you the mic. And also for those of you who are on the live stream, you can leave it in the YouTube chat. We'll start here, and then I will pass it back there.
Thank you. Hey, how's it going? So I'm here. I'm here with 4 comrades. We're from an organization from Patterson called Silk City Socialists, and we try to do tenant organizing. The organization has existed for 2 years, although I joined more recently. But part of the thing that, part of what I've seen in the time I've been in the organization is that, we don't have a lot of resources, and a lot of times when we go out flyering or things like that, we encounter people that have needs that we can't really provide a solution to, And also, like, some of the actions that we do, because of how unprotected tenants are and all these things, could even potentially be risky for tenants, right? So like the conversation about like all the movements that you've participated in is amazing, right? But I'm wondering, like, how, like, if you have any advice about sort of the starting steps, and how to balance this thing between, like, reaching out to people in need but also having the resources necessary to help them, because otherwise it might even end up being kind of unethical potentially, you know. So any advice in that regard would be very appreciated. Thank you.
Okay. I mean, the very first thing I would say is, and I'm happy to connect with you after, but we definitely should get you looped into Housing Justice for All, right? We have a ton of resources that we offer groups that are doing tenant organizing, that are just available, right, for use. And we're often able to connect people to legal groups in their area. So I'm not guaranteeing, right, but or other groups that are organizing near them, and then there can be shared resources. So first and foremost, like, we really should get you looped into that group, and that, I think, will just be a huge first step. In just a very specific practical sense, right, whenever I'm working with folks who are just starting off organizing, often what I'll try to say is to pick a building or a landlord, because in the absence of good cause eviction protections, right, in the existence we are, where holdover evictions are legal, you really do want to have that shared power that you can leverage against an entity. And so either you can visibly see that there's a building that looks like a good target, right, because it's dilapidated, or you can go to your local city hall and it's public record to get code violations. A lot of times you can find them online. Look for your worst code violator, right, or your building with the most violations, and canvass that building. And if you can get a majority of the building to want to join in on an action, right, a landlord is very likely to evict one tenant who's withholding rent to spur repairs, or even two tenants who are withholding rent to spur repairs. But it is much harder for a landlord to evict 3/4 of their building. Now all of a sudden that feels not in their best self-interest, because that's a huge hit to their pocketbook that they're going to think twice about, you know, doing lightly. And all of a sudden it might make more sense to make the repairs than losing 3/4 of their income, because you've got 3/4 of the tenants who've decided they're going to band together and withhold rent, right? So those are, like, that just in a practical sense sometimes is a good way to get like a foothold into that tenant organizing, as opposed to just like canvassing and having 2 people here with a shared landlord, 2 people there with a shared landlord. You know what I mean? But definitely let's connect after, and I'll give you the information for the coalition.
Is anybody else looking to answer that question?
Well, not answer it exactly, because obviously I don't know the details of what you're dealing with. Good luck. But as a general thing, I suppose over the years I've come to realise that, and in a way it's a double-edged issue in a sense, because I think part of the problem we have with organising around housing is that people do feel overwhelmed by the size of the challenge for the reasons that we've been discussing, these multinational, multi-billion organisations that we're up against, and that is daunting. But I also think you have to start somewhere. And I agree with Rebecca, a lot of the time that is about picking a target, because you're not going to be able to solve the whole problem individually or in isolation. But I do think that it is, I've come to realise, it took me about 30 years, but all housing campaigns are in essence local. Of course they're related to much bigger things, but at the end of the day they are, well, about home, right? And home is about locality. And so, you know, I think thinking carefully about where to commit your limited resources is very important, and not feeling, and put it this way, overly responsible for trying to solve the whole of the problem, because it's about all of us doing our bit, not about you doing all of it.
And I'm so sorry, can I say one other? one other thing that sometimes is helpful, again, I would try to pick a concentrated group of folks, even if you're not gonna use their landlord as a target, right? But if there's this dilapidated building, right, and there's still such a legitimate fear of organizing against their landlord, let's take this good cause eviction legislation that we're definitely winning next year. I'm willing it into space. You know, organizing them into that campaign, right, feels really relevant to their experience. And what I say to a lot of tenants around that is, you can be involved, right, and come to Albany and testify and share a story about a former tenant situation, right, a former living situation. So you don't have to share your current one, which feels really vulnerable. You're naming your current landlord, puts you at real risk, right, of like a retaliatory eviction. You can share a story of a place you formerly lived, right? Name that situation. And then there's not that same level of consequence and fear, but it's still first person, impact driven, and really impactful.
Thank you. I'm going to hand it to you.
Check. Okay. Thanks, first of all, for the panelists, organizers, everyone putting this on. It's been a wonderful discussion. My name is Aaron, and the thing I wanted to bring up is how some of our policy approaches, as we've mentioned, they put money into the hands of developers. Other examples, we have like national stimuli, or we have state-level rental assistance, which they go to renters, but then they end up in the pockets of landlords. So ultimately, those are sort of self-defeating when it comes to breaking up the power of the landlords as a class if they're going to continue to get paid the same rent. So what do you think of going on a more offensive set of strategies against them, whether it be reducing or eliminating the rents that they can collect to any degree, or, for example, increasing penalties for vacancies, or doing other things which limit their ability to pick and choose when and whom and for how much they rent to people? Thank you.
It's open to any of you to take on. And also, if Savina online had anything to say, let us know. We can wave and let you there.
Well, I mean, this might be one of the areas where I think there might be some contextual difference between where I'm from and where you are. Albeit that the housing picture in Britain is changing significantly, and private renters are now much more part of the picture, if you will, than they were 20, 30 years ago. About 20% of people in Britain now are private tenants, and it's significantly more in the big cities. So again, as I say, the latent power is there. But I think along with the realisation that all housing is local has come the one that ultimately all housing policy is political. And so I'm not against giving landlords a hard time. And, you know, Blackstone and whoever else, you know, they're fair game as far as I'm concerned, albeit that you need to pick your targets. But, you know, I think ultimately these are about political decisions. And it's about politicians who oftentimes will take our votes with the promise of doing something about these kinds of issues and then forget about it as soon as they're in power. So, as I say, I'm not wanting to let the landlords off the hook, but these decisions are political in essence. And so I think, you know, if I'm thinking about where are our primary where should we prioritise our energies? Personally, I think that's about, of course, building the movement, but that movement needs to be targeting first and foremost our politicians, and as and when necessary, and this hasn't happened enough, although I know it's happening a bit here, changing them. Because if they're not going to represent us on an issue as fundamental as housing, then they shouldn't be representing us at all.
I couldn't agree more, right? I mean, I think the place we all want to get to, right, is decommodification, which ultimately will lead to that. And housing should be for me, it's the ultimate irony that we have some regulated housing, right? And it's still free market driven, but it's just like the bare minimum. And when we talk about having the entire industry regulated, people act as if we're speaking of something that's, yes, Marxist or even crazy, in their mind, it's beyond, right? Meanwhile, we regulate utilities, not necessarily effectively, but we regulate the utilities that are literally in the housing because there's some general recognition that it can't be left to the free market because it's too important and everybody needs to access it. So like, where is the rationale that a utility is too important to be left to the free market, but not the actual shelter that the utility exists in, right? Like it's so nonsensical. It's so nonsensical. But I couldn't agree more, right, that the path to that is the politicians. And all of you who've been involved in this, and I feel like a lot of you, or almost all of you have, know that, like so much of the demands we make now are that no politician take real estate donations, right? And we shame the heck out of the ones who do, right? And we try to make sure that they don't win their elections if they do, as you said, right? Like if you're going to align yourself with that industry, then we're going to try to make sure that you don't sit in a place of power. And I think that's the pathway, right, to getting these policies that are centered in justice and equity and not profit. So.
Thank you. I think we'll take one or two more questions. I see one back here.
Hi, thanks. So this is open to all of you, but in response to something that Rebecca, you said about the kind of like contradiction of property rights, but not respecting the like rights to indigenous the indigenous rights of the land and so forth. So I was wondering if any of you had thoughts on policies or practices or principles on how to avoid like replicating that contradiction as we advocate for things like public housing and tenant rights and so on.
I just want to add something here. And I see, Rebecca, you have the mic, you can answer his question, but I just want to add my thoughts a little bit here. That we know that we're hearing the creaks of a dying system, right? We know that this capitalist system is, I'm speaking to the experts here, it's about maximizing profits and commodifying everything. We were built here in the US off the backs of labor exploitation, right? We know that. When you think about what's happening in Detroit around the water crisis, and how the system is so intricately tied there that they're snatching children out of the homes of parents that can't afford water. And they can explain it better than I can, but this is it's a dying system. And we've got to, again, I'm going to continue to say it, begin to think of ways to dismantle, upend, and restructure this society. Over the years, we've heard the same thing over and over and over and over again. We've been fighting for decades, not centuries, in this system with a constitution that continues to separate out who gets to have access to privilege, unearned privilege, right? And we're sick and tired of it. And this is not coming from me, it's coming from the many folks, brothers and sisters that I work with throughout the the years. And we're at a verge, we're at a tipping point right now. We can talk about this until we're blue in the face. And if nothing changes, nothing changes. And it hasn't. It just hasn't. Our concern is also those that are just going to be evicted, that have never been homeless before. And we know the stigma behind people that are poor. Rebecca, you were just saying it, that people were afraid it would rub off. I mean, that's part of the evangelical backward, distorted moral narrative around the poor, right? We're in a battle for the Bible right now because of the distorted, the way people distort scripture and use it against the poor, right? I'll take my minister's hat off. I won't say too much more, but they've used every facet of this society to break us. And if they cannot profit off of our backs, then they would rather kill us. And we're seeing that. But I can tell you this, the Union of the Homeless, along with this broad and deep network and the Poor People's Campaign, will continue to fight on the ground and take action together, right? As we fight for bread, peace, and land in this country. Right? I just want to end with that.
Beautiful as always, and painfully true. Yeah, my answer is going to be really short. And I'll take all three of my organizational hats off. This is my answer. There is no way we move forward until we atone for our original sins of colonization and slavery. And so there has to be a reckoning, a reparations, right, before we can move forward. There's whatever policy that's equitable now cannot be implemented equitably because of the centuries of racial capitalism. Period, right? Just period.
David, or shall I? Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understood your question. I'm going to have a go answering the question that I think you asked, and if I'm getting it wrong, tell me afterwards. I would recommend people watch the debate from Albany the other night, the first, wasn't it? It was the night of the storm, significantly enough, and I want to come back to the storm because we haven't referred to it, and it is relevant. But it was an extraordinary spectacle, certainly from my point of view. Maybe you lot are all used to it, but I'd not really seen anything quite like it, because it was this kind of visceral reaction from predominantly Republican, although not exclusively Republican politicians, to this sort of, in their eyes, existential threat of evictions being delayed to some extent. And the person who summed up the debate, I think for the Republicans, but I'll stand corrected, is a fellow called Mark Walsick, and he actually had the audacity to invoke Native Americans and their mistreatment, to put it very mildly, as some kind of twisted justification for why the eviction moratorium should not be renewed. I mean, it was extraordinary. But I suppose what came into my mind when you raised it is meeting a First Nation, they call themselves Indian, I'm never sure about this, but anyway, in Canada, in the Yukon, where some of my family are that I referred to earlier. And I was talking to John, his name was, about about this sort of stuff and housing back home in Britain and so on. And we talked about a thing that perhaps you're aware of, and certainly David will be, the right to buy, which is part of the, if you like, our original housing sin. I'm not putting it on a scale of the genocide of Native Americans, but of housing at least, was Margaret Thatcher's totemic policy to sell off council housing one by one. Now actually we've lost far more through bigger forms of privatisation in actual fact. But nonetheless, certainly from an ideological point of view, the idea that council tenants, like my grandparents, they were offered the opportunity, having lived in council housing for the better part of their lives as tenants, paying a very affordable rent, living in the kind of conditions that they had not really expected in their lifetimes. I remember it vividly, 3-bedroom cottage estate in Dagenham's, a massive council estate on the outskirts of East London. And my nan and granddad always said it is the best thing that ever happened to us, was being able to move from where they had been into this council house. And so when the right to buy came up, there was this issue about, well, are you going to do it or not? Now, they didn't, and I'm not judging people who do because it was massively incentivized financially. I'm aware that there's some mooting of this happening here as well, and must be avoided at all costs, costs being the operative word. But when I talked to John, this First Nation fellow, about the right to buy, he sort of looked at me in bewilderment because it just didn't compute with the ideology and beliefs of the First Nations. Now, I don't know a great deal about that, but I do think, and this is often a tricky thing because a lot of the time we're kind of firefighting around campaigns, but I do think at some point in all this we have to be looking to a changing of hearts and minds around housing. It isn't just about policy, albeit that, as I've said, it is about politics and messy politics at times and vast flows of capital as well. But actually it is also about the kind of society that we want to live in. And I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention to that, and perhaps First Nation and Native Americans could help us to do that to some extent.
Thank you all. I'm going to take one more question back here. And then we're going to have a closing, but you are free to chat with our organizers after if you're okay with that. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel. It was wonderful. My name is Jocelyn. I was a tenant advocate for 3 years for folks in public and subsidized housing. And I think one thing, along with everything that was mentioned today, that we constantly ran into, along with just this history of racial capitalism, is also just the very natural tie to prison industrial complex and mass incarceration. So many folks would lose their vouchers because of a police report, an encounter with police generally, a former record. And for so many of us who do this housing justice work, there is this very natural connection that has to be done to abolition. These two worlds exist as one, and one movement can't occur without the other. So there's all this wonderful work being done on the ground for this. But at the same time, with housing justice and abolition, doing these sort of small steps to these larger visions can somewhat seem demoralizing or very overwhelming to folks, because on the one hand, abolition, we're imagining a world where prisons don't exist. And with housing justice, we want to sort of undo this idea of housing as profit, housing as sort of this, housing as not a right, and we want to work towards housing as a right, where we shouldn't even have to pay for housing. And I guess my question is, what are some sort of experiences you've had or thoughts you've had on those connections, and what are some ways to kind of keep that momentum in the movement going for folks who sort of get lost in the big picture, but also know that there are these little small steps we can do to that, but it all seems, you know, with this constant backdrop, you know, just as long as this sort of neoliberal framework exists, that it seems almost impossible to get to those moments when we have so many other things to focus on, like eviction moratorium, right to counsel, all of these other things.
That really resonates with me. And to me, in terms of, I mean, there's so many movements, right? And that was named before, like, where do you start? You know, when you could. But to me, you know, abolition and housing justice are probably the two, and Savina spoke to this before, right? Are probably the two that feel a lot of times the most interconnected to me. So I kind of want to talk about it in very briefly in two ways. One is I'm constantly working with my comrades in that field to think about how we intersect the work, right? And you so named ways in which that can happen. I mean, we absolutely need to lift the restriction of formerly incarcerated folks from accessing public housing, because it's not just them. Then when they, they can't even visit family because their family members who were in public housing could lose their public housing just from, I mean, it's the most inhumane, bananas system. And again, so destabilizing to communities. So, it's that, right? It's so intentional, right? We all know this. This is not accidental. It is completely designed to ensure recidivism, because that's what our society wants, to lock up, right, and incarcerate Black and brown people. But we need to do a better job of being intersectional in our organizing, because when that doesn't happen, it does draw capacity from our communities in a way that's unnecessary and exhausting. To your second point, right, this is like the thing that I think happens. It's very difficult in movements, right? That tightrope between fighting for the North Star and incrementalism, and is that selling out, or is it building a path to winning the North Star? I don't have the answer to it. I can tell you what my personal philosophy is, that you win the North Star by creating a path to get there. I think it is a more strategic way to get there. I think when you ask for Z and say, I'll only take Z, it takes you longer to get Z. Not that you won't. It's just, and this is my personal opinion. There's like, all the opinions on this are valid, right? But I think when you can eke away the sickness and the cancer that is in like our societal mental, right? When you can eke away at how sick we are and how it's actually not based in reality and truth, it gets us to where we want to be, as opposed to like throwing a cold water bucket on it, and saying decommodify housing. Well, if you can start to take parts of housing from the stock and decommodify them, and all of a sudden people realize the sky didn't fall, then we can have all our housing decommodified. And if we can start to take huge chunks of like police away and say, okay, they didn't provide public safety, they caused serious harm and violence, then our society hopefully starts to really re-envision what public safety looks like. But again, I have no answer. I think they're all valid conversations, and everybody who's involved in that movement work has like a voice, and like, you know what I mean? I think we all, the one thing I do think is that we all have to like fight that together, right? Whatever our path is, we can't let it split us, right? We have to like do that work together and like give space for the fact that it might look different, because the North Star is something we do share.
Right, yeah. Thank you for that question. There are so many things that have to happen all at the same time that are interlocked, and we're trying so hard to strike a balance, but we also know that if we don't band together, if we don't start getting out of our own silos and joining forces to fight, all of these systems at the same time, we can't do one without the other. We're talking about all those systemics, right? Racism, poverty, ecological devastation, and health, the war economy, right? We suffer the social and economic costs of ongoing wars, right? We know what they're taking out of the dollars they're taking out of the federal budget and putting it into the war chest, right? Where we just see mega poverty programs leaving us that we don't want, that don't work anymore. Anyway, everything has to be restructured. And religion, that taps into our belief system, the wrong-headed type of I want to say nationalism or evangelical distorted religion that taps into our belief system and raises us up in this society to, do the things that we're seeing, right? We're seeing what happened January 6th, with the insurrection. They would talk about God and guns, right? And the churches were raising them up to fight against it, right? Racialized capitalism. But there's so many things we have to do at the same time, but it is critical in this period, this up and coming period now, that we do the best that we can to band together. Tenant organizing, like Rebecca was saying. I'd love to hear more of the work that you're doing, Rebecca. Every single social justice organization and abolitionist organization that's fighting together must continue to fight together and really band together. I love what the Poor People's Campaign is doing around the fusion movement, right? Building. Look, we're not going to get out of this alive anyway, right? So we may as well come together across every line of division, right? And work together. And I'm going to keep saying that because that's what's happening. We think it's my movement's over here, your movement's over here. No. But we have to band together. We need all of you. Glyn, David, you should be in the movement. Get in, jump in. Organize with us, get into the trenches, get into those encampments, get into some of those shelters, right? Organize with us. We got a lot of people that you could meet, roll your sleeves up and jump in there with us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Savina, Glyn, David, Rebecca. Any other remaining optimistic words to get us going on this crisis, or remaining statements?
We're going to win good cause next year.
Well,
Power
not optimistic
concedes
in
nothing.
some ways. Oh, no, go ahead.
Nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. The late, great Frederick Douglass.
I am an optimistic person in general, but I think my remarks finally are more realistic, perhaps. Obviously, there's so much you can talk about housing, and Justin, I would like maybe talk to you afterwards about that connection between housing and the penal system. But we haven't specifically talked about the direct link between bad housing and bad health. And again, there's never been a more relevant time to talk about that. And nor have we talked about the very direct link, and thinking about what's been happening here in the last couple of weeks, between our housing system and our ecological system. And again, that's a subject of its own right. But where those things collide is in a basement in Queens. And people be aware. Aware of what happened last week. And, we kid ourselves if we think that couldn't happen to us, because it is all of our futures, and in that sense, tomorrow is today.
One of the things that I think is maybe useful to do is to think about the housing question in relationship to many other facets of daily life in the city. And I think that many people who might have a little problem about just housing could certainly rally to the idea that the improvement of the quality of daily life is a worthwhile political project, and there are many different components to that, everything from water supply to safety in the face of environmental dangers, and therefore there's some sort of not only a moral imperative, which I might share, but also a sensibility to a project, that we want our city to be different from what it is. It's not only housing, it's all kinds of things. And there are some things that are actually rather good about New York City, and they can be developed and pushed. So in a sense, it's very important to put this question of organizing around tenants' rights and so on in the context of what makes for a good city. What do we want to be able to do in our daily lives? And that involves security, it involves all kinds of things. And one of the problems about organizing, and I haven't been really involved very much for about the last 15 years, but before I used to do quite a lot. Yes, the silos become a problem. Groups would be dedicated. And you know, those of you who've worked on projects know very well that you work 24 hours a day, very often on a very targeted project, and it takes all of your time, and somebody comes along and says, hey, come and help us with this struggle about water, and you kind of say, I don't have time to do it. And so there's inevitably a segmentation that occurs of effort. And I don't think that necessarily is to be condemned, but it is an awkward aspect. And therefore having if I was going to be a utopianist for a moment, maybe, you know, once or twice a year there should be an assembly for the whole city where everybody would talk about what the problems are and how the problems relate to one another, and then go back to organizing in their own neighborhoods again. Because there is an issue here, which is, you know, the qualities of everyday life have in many respects, I think, deteriorated around issues like public health and environmental protections and all the rest of it. And that they have to be remedied, and they have to be remedied across the board. So it would be very useful in general, I think, to try to figure out some way to bring it all together. I used to work very much along the idea of the right to the city. And the right to the city was a kind of a good slogan, and everybody can say, well, I want the right to the city. At the time, I think even Michael Bloomberg said he wanted the right to the city, and God damn it, he had it. And I didn't, and I was pissed off. So that was, you know, we can approach things a bit that way. So I think that maybe one of the things we should do is to deal with all the nitty-gritty stuff and try to concentrate on particular targets, but to get some sense of how that target relates to the idea of what would make for a better quality of daily life in the city. Because that, in the end of the day, is what we're living with, and what's going on around us, and that is, for me anyway, one of the key questions as to how to integrate that sense of changing the quality of daily life into the many particular kinds of struggles that exist on particular issues.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. We are so grateful that you are here today. A round of applause. Our cafe is still open. We are open till 9 tonight. Some of the panelists might be able to stick around if you have questions. And please check the People's Forum website for additional events and panels that we have the rest of this week and the following. Thank you all so much, and have a great night.